This week, it is one of the biggest diplomatic moments since Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Tomorrow, the eyes of the world will be on Alaska, an American state with fewer than 750,000 residents, where Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will meet to discuss the future of the conflict. Now, ahead of the summit, briefing from both sides has alluded to a ceasefire deal which could allow Russia to retain occupied Ukrainian territory. But Volodymyr Zelensky says anything other than de facto recognition is impossible. So will these talks result in a bilateral deal between Washington and Moscow? And is Kiev positioned to do anything about it? Well, we'll be answering your questions on that and on more with our expert panel.
I'm Olga Robinson.
I'm Matthew Savill.
I'm James Waterhouse.
And I'm Jamie Coomarasamy. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
OK, we're going to get to some of your questions in just a moment, but let's just focus on the fabric of the talks in Alaska for a moment, because they've come together very quickly. James, you've been following this closely. What do you think we should be expecting?
Well, we've just had the Kremlin release the schedule, and I think it's quite revealing because we've heard a lot, haven't we, about what Ukraine and the West want from it, notably Europe. And Donald Trump has said he has listened. But we've just had this from the Kremlin today. They say they've outlined a 5-hour itinerary where, first off, you will have Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin engage in a tête-à-tête, French for one-on-one, meeting, just involving both men and their interpreters. After that, each side will be flanked by 5 senior officials to engage in further discussions, and then after that there will be a joint press conference, and you can be sure that there will be a nervous wait from this side of the Atlantic as to what that would mean. But the Kremlin's quoted as saying, for the summit agenda, it's obvious that the core topic will be the Ukrainian crisis, as they put it, instead of a full-scale invasion. But the Kremlin also talks about broader tasks like regional security and questions and around US and Russian cooperation and the perceived potential for trade and economic cooperation between the two countries. So, that is clear. The Kremlin outwardly is looking to improve its own relationship with Washington. And I think the nervous thing for Ukraine and its European allies is that Washington wants to do the same. It also wants to improve things, as well as showing an impatience to end this war in the eyes of some critics here, regardless of the detail.
Yeah, I mean, that's the readout from the Kremlin. What sense have you got then from the Americans via these talks with the Europeans over the last day or two? Do we have a clear sense of what Donald Trump wants to get out of this?
Well, I mean, Donald Trump, we all know, can change his mind at short notice. But clearly, Europe was working hard yesterday in this virtual call where it had European leaders, including Zelensky and Merz in Germany. Friedrich Merz organised this call. And when they emerged, both men yesterday, I mean, it was clear they were working hard to keep the president's attention and to try and shape his thinking in any way. And they claim that Donald Trump agreed to not negotiate over Ukraine in Europe's head, that Ukraine would have the ability to defend itself in the long term, and that any occupied territory would never be legally recognised. And you heard Donald Trump afterwards saying, look, it was a 10 out of 10 call. I get on with these people and I've listened. But I think it's this time gap now. We are talking ahead of this Alaskan summit. We're getting a sense of what the Russians will bring to the table. And I think if you suddenly have America moving from its position to say, look, Europe, we've got these red lines, to, well, actually, maybe we could talk about territory. What if we did give you this in exchange for that? That is then very hard to reverse if you're Ukraine, if in that joint press conference in Alaska, such announcements are made, and then Zelensky in the subsequent meeting, he's already playing catch up and having to change Donald Trump's mind. So those are the expectations for now.
Interesting. Olga, James talks about that subsequent meeting. Donald Trump talking about perhaps having another quick meeting with the 3 leaders, with him, if he's invited, President Zelensky and Putin. But it's clear that for Vladimir Putin, coming to the table, he was absolutely clear he only wanted one other person at the table at this stage, and that's Donald Trump.
Yes, indeed. And it's been his tactic all along, ever since President Trump returned to power and started talking about the need for peace negotiations and a peace deal. And generally, I think it tells you a lot about how Vladimir Putin and the Russian state as a whole see Ukraine in all of this process, because they don't see Ukraine as an equal, but more of a subject of negotiations. And they directly talking to effectively to the US president and US officials. So it's almost, I think what they're trying to do is create the impression this like great powers, like very much Soviet style, Cold War style diplomacy, or where a great power of Russia versus he's talking directly to a great power, which is the US, but bypassing the actual country that is being invaded.
Yeah, and Matthew, let's turn, if we can, to how this is being seen, this summit, within the defence and security community. I certainly got the impression when it was announced, first of all, there was quite a lot of scrambling. I mean, the Foreign Office, I know, were saying, what is going on here? How can we make sure that Ukraine's interests are met as best as possible in this? But what sense are you getting?
I think there has been obviously an interest in what comes next in terms of the role that the US is playing, and to a degree, the focus has been on the tone that Trump has been adopting, and we've got this roller coaster ride, which we've seen in this past week in microcosm, and that he's gone from being very critical of the Ukrainians to appearing to lose patience with Putin and Russia. But the threats that he has made of sanctions are imminent. The deadlines keep on being passed. So the unilateral ceasefire, the previous attempts, they've all kind of been blown through, and the Russians have played it out. And so when this came about, it seemed to be both welcome in terms of a sign of engagement, but I think concerning in terms of what the actual detail is. I think the big thing is that it seemed pretty clear that nobody really knew what Witkoff had agreed when he went to Moscow, and there was back briefing afterwards, but there needed to be a couple of goes at clarification in terms of what had actually been discussed. And I think that we can see that if we're looking ahead tomorrow, if we were to discuss what is on the table, the details are not clear. All it seems to be is that we can understand that it is about some kind of cessation of hostilities, almost certainly temporary, and the terms are all over the place, and you've even seen a downplaying of expectations from quite bullish statements at the start of the week from Trump to, I'm going to go and see what it's like, and I'll know.
A listening exercise, it's right. Called. But he's broken with convention post the invasion by engaging with Putin like this, and I mean, so far, whatever the West has done, sanctions, other forms of pressure, it hasn't been effective in bringing an end to the war or even getting a ceasefire. So is there an argument that the US and Europe should have pursued a dialogue with the Kremlin sooner?
I think there is. I mean, obviously, I was in government for part of this. There was communication backwards and forwards. There was a significant focus on actually the Ukrainians being the one who determined the pace and the depth of those contacts. They have maintained contacts with the Russian government through a variety of means because they've had these prisoner swap deals. I think Europe was a bit cautious about being seen to, if you like, dictate terms. And there's already plenty of myth making about deals that were agreed previously that Boris Johnson allegedly
very early
torpedoed, which is not true, which are a misrepresentation of what happened. But I think there was an abundance of caution about seeing to sort of wade in and dictate terms to the Ukrainians. If you were being critical on the diplomatic front, you might say after a certain point that became drift, that the US decision to sort of not get too heavily engaged actually meant that there wasn't the necessary pressure brought to bear at certain points, and that's true in terms of weapons supplies and military support as well.
We'll come back, I'm sure, to some of these points, but let's push on with the questions that we've had, because these are bilateral talks, as we've emphasised. But this first listener question, as they often are, is, well, it's about one man only.
Hi Ukrainecast, this is Bruce in Devon. My question before the summit in Alaska is, what is Donald Trump really after? What is in it for Trump? Not for America, but for Trump. And why is Trump taking it on himself to negotiate on behalf of Ukraine without being invited to take that role?
Well, Matthew, you mentioned how careful the UK and other Europeans were not to talk for Ukraine. I mean, that question is to that point, really, and Donald Trump seeming to, in the words of Bruce, negotiate on behalf of Ukraine. What do you make of that?
I have to engage in a degree of political prognostication here, and try and sort of talk about a number of factors. I think that there are multiple things at play. There are things like ego. Trump wants to be seen to be the person who's made the deal. There's a lot of talk around him about how he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, and look at all these wars that he stopped, and some of those are wild exaggeration. But all of the people who have spoken to him do think he actually does have a deep, almost like visceral aversion to conflict, and that is playing a role. There's also the question of US policy is to try and disengage from commitments in Europe to a degree and focus on China and the Indo-Pacific. And therefore it's in their interests to tamp down what is happening in Europe so that they can switch focus. I mean, that's been true of multiple administrations. The argument is, of course, therefore they should increase military support, but he's taking a different approach. And then I think finally there is something as simplistic as he wants to contrast himself with his predecessors. His argument is that Biden failed to deal with a number of situations, and therefore he is demonstrating American strength and power. The problem is that both the patience necessary to do that and the discipline are not his strong areas. And so there is this constant fear that he is going to get very heavily involved and then give up and just sort of lose interest and say, it's over to you, Europe. So I think what's in it for him is a combination of US politics and personal prestige. And
James, is that what you're picking up from the European side?
Well, I think they're looking to, I mean, look, if you look inside Ukraine, there is a broad appetite for peace. And so you've got Donald Trump, who, for motivations discussed, who is pursuing peace. He wants to end this war and get the credit for doing so, as most world leaders would. So I think Europe want to ride on the coattails of that ambition, but at the same time, I mean, as we saw in that conference yesterday, keep harking back to the detail, keep urging the US to say, look, that's fine. Of course we want a ceasefire first, but we need some kind of underwriting in that you will take escalatory measures if Russia, as we firmly believe, does reignite its war down the line and your attention is turned elsewhere, because Vladimir Putin has we know how he feels about the very existence of Ukraine. We know how he feels about wanting to restore lost influence as he sees it. And so I think that is what Europe is fixating on. And if it can straddle the catalyst of Donald Trump when it comes to what is going to be a very complicated negotiation with keeping him anchored in detail, then that would really be quite something. But it's a tall order.
Thanks, James. We're going to turn to a different sort of detail now. There's more diplomacy, of course, to discuss, but let's break things up a bit with this next question.
Hi, Ukrainecast. It's Roger from South Wales here. With the summit coming up on Friday, has the fighting on the front lines intensified or decreased? Thanks. Bye.
Olga, you've been keeping a close eye on this.
Yeah, Russia has been making incremental gains along the front line, particularly in Ukraine's east over the past few months. And these gains seem to have been accelerating a little bit over the past 2 weeks. So we've got data from the Institute for the Study of War, which is a US-based think tank that analyzes conflicts. And it shows that since the Russian summer offensive began in May, its forces have advanced on average like 15 to 16 square kilometers per day on average. And since the start of August, this has increased to 23 square kilometers a day on average. So a bit of an increase. And there's been a lot of intense speculation this week in particular around the situation not far from Pokrovsk, which is a key logistical hub for Ukrainian army that the Russians have been trying to take for months and failing. And the ISW has assessed that small sabotage groups, Russian sabotage groups, have infiltrated Ukrainian defenses in that area, but they do not control the territory. And there's like very little footage that we are seeing. So it's really difficult to analyze like independently how big of a development that is.
Matthew, do you have any sense?
I think what was just described in terms of the scale, it's difficult to know because what we have is a combination of social media reporting, and then there are analysts out there who are trying to look at imagery and see where forces are or where defensive lines are, and there can be that can be produced within a couple of hours, but the lag can be a couple of days, and it's very hard to get a feel for numbers. I think it's problematic in two ways. One, in presentational terms, it's clear that the Russians have managed to get through some of the Ukrainian defensive positions and are roving in some kind of strength, perhaps a little larger than we thought yesterday, because what the Ukrainians have announced today in terms of the numbers of Russians captured and killed and involved in fighting is several hundred. That doesn't look good before the summit because it kind of gives Putin the ability to say, well, I've got momentum. Even by talking, I'm making a concession, so I can demand more, potentially, slightly worryingly. On the ground, what it represents is another thrust that threatens what is called the sort of the fortress belt that the Ukrainians have along the Donbass and particularly in Donetsk. And that is particularly around a small number of cities and towns, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, which represent, if you like, a bulwark protecting the remaining 25 to 30%, particularly of Donetsk, that the Russians haven't advanced on. And they are having to encircle some of these locations, a bit like they've done with Pokrovsk, because the Russians can't get into them. But as they move forward, they can launch more drones, they can launch more artillery. Pokrovsk has mostly been destroyed. They're beginning to get around the flanks of this belt. And so they are putting more pressure on the Ukrainian defensive position, and they have a policy of not one step back. So they're desperately trying to hold on to every inch of territory, but that means they are suffering this increasing flow of casualties whilst territory is being destroyed, whilst the Russians can get at their logistics and support lines more. And the Russians are prepared to pay that cost in people, and it's much more damaging for the Ukrainians. Also, it's worth noting that what we've had researchers in country recently, the front lines are much more blurred now. You have almost the positions operating alongside or behind each other, because particularly the Ukrainians are covering dozens of kilometres or several kilometres of width with a dozen or so people, and that's why they're using drones so much. And that means you have this sort of contact area where the lines are intermingled. We can come back to that. But
I was going to say, when you're talking about any kind of deal that involves,
where's the front line?
Yeah,
it's very difficult to know now. But it means that the Russians are pressing everywhere, and they're looking for these soft spots.
Olga, the point you made about how difficult it's been to verify this because of a lack of information, posts on social media coming out. Is this a new phenomenon? Have previous advances, pushes been more transparent, if you like?
I think it depends on the situation. It certainly, I think this latest development reminded me a little bit of the incursion into Kursk, because there was a lot of speculation, and there's no shortage of claims from both sides about what's going on and how far some units have gone or how they're being fought back against. But when it comes to actual visuals that you can analyze, there's not much. And sometimes we also rely on satellite imagery to see signs of fresh fighting. But then sometimes that also doesn't happen because there's cloud in the area. That often does happen along the front line. So it's really difficult for us to say. There's in the war of words, it's really difficult sometimes to pinpoint the exact extent or severity of what's happening when you've got competing claims, but that not much visuals to actually analyze. But it does happen quite on a regular basis, and there's often delays with how we're getting information, because obviously for operation security purposes, sometimes video is not leaked deliberately so. And sometimes it's leaked with a delay, and it wants to present the situation in a more favourable position for one side or the other.
Thanks, Olga. Well, look, as Donald Trump regularly likes to remind his counterparts in NATO, that front line is much closer to their doorsteps than to America's. And that's the subject of our next question.
Hi, Ukrainecast. This is Claudia from Croatia. I have a question related to the forthcoming meeting in Alaska. I wanted to ask you what you think is the leverage of power of Europe in this. Say, for instance, in a scenario where Trump was to force upon Ukraine a ceasefire with Russia, which comes with a land swap, who would be the guarantor for this? I can't imagine Europe would accept to act as a guarantor for something they haven't been part of the negotiation for. And how realistic would that ever be to be in place and keep on going? Thank you very much for your help. Thank you. Bye-bye.
James, let's turn to you for this one. Guarantees, guarantors. What's your sense of Europe as a guarantor?
Well, I think we've seen Europe harden its position ahead of what is a feared blueprint being imposed on them. So if you had a scenario where, for example, Ukraine was compelled to hand over the rest of that other 25% of the Donetsk region to Russia, what Europe is saying is, we won't agree to anything Ukraine doesn't. And Ukraine is saying, we won't agree to the handing over of territory, full stop. It goes against our constitution. I think the small area of leverage that Europe has is that it is not America that will be policing or enforcing such a frozen conflict or the handing over of that territory. And so Donald Trump needs to calculate, okay, if they're not playing ball, do I wipe my hands of this and presumably allow Russia to make further gains regardless? Would he want that as part of his legacy on trying to stop this war in Europe? Or does Europe risk incurring his wrath, and actually Donald Trump cuts off all military help and doesn't even supply weapons for Europe to purchase on Ukraine's behalf? So I think it's the implementation where Europe possibly has some kind of leverage. But to be honest, I think there is a real risk that if you've got these areas of cooperation that the Kremlin's going after in Alaska, it's hard to imagine Donald Trump bringing out the American stick in a joint press conference where they say, yes, we're exploring this deeper economic cooperation. We're going to relax some tariffs, but you're not going to stop fighting. So actually, I'm going to follow through with hiking tariffs on your trading partners, for example. So there are these contradictions going on. And then, of course, there's the practical reality of if there was to be territory handed over in some senses. Those cities that Matthew referenced, these are big places that have not relatively come close to falling, apart from Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians have made huge sacrifices defending. Is Ukraine really going to allow Russian forces to just march in and come all the way up to the region's border with Dnipropetrovsk region, for example? It's impossible to imagine that.
Well, I mean, let's turn that round if we can. And what if Trump and Putin then come out of a meeting with what they feel is a shared plan, and it's not something that the Ukrainians, the Europeans are happy with? What then? Matthew, perhaps, does Ukraine have the weight to say no?
It does, but with significant risks. I think one of the questions about does Europe have leverage? Well, leverage with whom? Unfortunately, the country with whom Europe has the most leverage is Ukraine, because they're the alternative backers, or rather the complementary backers to the US. And they can influence Russia because, for example, they could significantly increase military support, or they could actually stop importing Russian LNG, liquid natural gas. It doesn't seem likely they're going to do that. They have relatively little leverage with the US, frankly, because it's not clear that they really have something that Trump wants. Because when I listed what he's interested for this for earlier, he's mostly focused on stopping the fighting now. Also, we're talking about a ceasefire rather than the terms of the big deal. if terms came out that were deeply unpalatable to the Ukrainians, I think, first of all, there would be pressure. They would fight on with no backers for a while, potentially. I think, such would be the level of defiance. But they would have a really difficult decision down the line, which is that the Russians would make gains, and at some point they would be faced with you can lose this now or you can lose it later, and one will be more expensive than the other. Europe could do more if it was willing to pay more. So, as I said, it could reduce its purchases of Russian energy supplies. It spent more in 2024 on Russian energy than it spent on military aid to Ukraine, astonishingly, by value. It could significantly increase its military support and compensate for the diminishing US military support. That'd be really expensive, though. It's not clear that European defence industry is in a position at the moment to supply the shortfall. And if you were defying the US, you could imagine that the US might switch off the thing that they did do recently, which is they provided a facility for European countries to buy US weapons and equipment to then give to Ukraine. So the danger is that what you would actually be doing is you would be making a defiant statement, and Europe could step up, but you would have a gap of several years in which Russia would have a window of opportunity to really hurt Ukraine.
And Olga, what about the optics of Ukraine rejecting something that is presented as a deal?
I mean, it's bad no matter what Zelensky does, because if he accepts the deal, then he will be incredibly unpopular inside the country. Because if there's any cessation of land or anything like that is proposed, then it will be overwhelmingly rejected by Ukrainians. Now, if he does the opposite, equally, he will be blamed by Russia and the US for being unwilling to participate and not wanting peace. So it really is a very difficult position. I think when it comes to also, I think we talk a lot about territory in all of this, but it's also about people. So if, for example, they freeze the front line along even the current blurred lines, what about the people who already live in occupation? If they cede more territory, what about the people who already live in those areas? Where do they go? What's going to happen to them? And when it comes to life in occupation, I think we discuss it very often in this podcast. It's very bleak if you are Ukrainian and you want to preserve your Ukrainian identity. So I think for me, this whole negotiation process is as much about territory as it is about lives of people.
But what about territory, James? Forget any deal and swaps, but just if there is something that freezes a conflict along its current lines, Matthew touched on how complex those front lines have become. How complex would that process in itself be to freeze the conflict?
Well, I mean, we saw when Vladimir Putin unilaterally announced his 2 pauses in fighting over the past couple of years. I think one time he did it as a Christmas goodwill gesture, and then he did it for Easter earlier this year. And, in some parts of the front line, we saw genuine lulls in drone attacks. We went to Kherson, which is sadly being emptied of life because the Russians have just been pounding it since retreating across the river. And the locals were saying, we have never seen it like this in 2 years. So there was a notable lull there, but ferocious fighting further east. And I think there is a complication in communicating to different troops who are effectively in their own silos along an enormous front line. I mean, we're talking about so much territory, hundreds of kilometres, 800 kilometres, I think. It's very difficult to coordinate a message to go out and say, okay, you can stop now. And as Matthew is saying, the front line is porous. Drones have created this inertia. So you need fewer soldiers in a trench. They're there for weeks on end now, where they have their supplies dropped to them by a drone, and they're there to kind of mark the land around them to defend it. But it is the drones that do the resupplying and the attacking on both sides. And actually the riskiest parts for the soldiers, where the loss of life happens, is when they are heading into the front line or being extracted from it in smaller vehicles because both sides tried to pick each other off. So, imagine if you clicked your finger, which it wouldn't be, but if you clicked the finger and said, right, fighting is frozen, and we're now going to work towards a peace deal, and say that peace deal, the terms were agreed, you're talking about this messy, enormous buffer zone where you can guarantee that fighting will break out in certain areas, and because of the appetite of all parties for the war, notably the West, for the war not to rear its head again, there might be blind eyes turned, there could be a miscommunication, but it's really messy and really, really complicated, no doubt about that.
Thanks, James. Well, and clearly this is not just a case of reaching an agreement or implementing one, but whether or not it actually leads to longer-term security. And that's a concern of one of our listeners.
Hi, Ukrainecast. This is Andrew Lloyd from Eastbourne. Just a thought, really. Putin obviously violated both Minsk agreements. He invaded Ukraine in the face of warnings that he shouldn't do it. So can we just hope that Trump at least pushes Putin, on why on earth we should believe anything, any kind of agreement that he agrees to? Because his record is that he will just walk through something he has previously signed.
Well, Matthew, we're back to that question about what Trump might do to get Putin to say that to get some assurances from him, and what sort of guarantees he's going to get. What are your thoughts? We've touched on this a bit with James, but I wonder what your thoughts are.
I think the big problem around tomorrow, first of all, we are assuming that there will be some kind of ceasefire deal, and I'm not sure that's a guarantee. If you ask me what I think the Russians are doing, it's showing willing. They're trying to avoid this threat of additional sanctions, which I don't think would stop them, but would complicate things massively.
Do you think that's what brought him to the table?
I think there's an opportunity. I think that the thing is that Trump's keenness for a deal, obviously, if it demonstrates that American power is coming in behind to apply pressure, is a positive if you're Ukrainian. But it's also opened the window for the Russians to say, well, we're back on the world stage, we've got proper recognition, we're the true peers having this discussion, never mind Ukraine, which is not even a real country if you're Putin. Let's talk to the grown-ups. Like, it's a kind of quite dismissive of Ukraine and the Europeans. It's also an opportunity for them to sort of drive things home. But I think for the time being, they're quite happy grinding onwards, taking 1,000 casualties a day and exhausting the Ukrainians. So I think what's as likely as even a ceasefire is them making an offer that shows willing, but they know the pressure will be on the Ukrainians and it won't be acceptable. And then the blame will go on the Ukrainians. But in terms of guarantees, I think the problem is that the US is not interested in playing any kind of role in terms of guaranteeing a ceasefire. It thinks that's a European responsibility. This is where we get on to, well, what does the coalition of the willing now look like, and what is it intended to do? I don't really think it is a guarantor in the sense that it will significantly deter Russia. But what you can see in some of the briefing that is emerging is they see themselves now morphing into something that will go in and provide a boost to Ukraine's ability to actually beef up its defences, prepare for a potentially inevitable further round of fighting, help with mobilisation, help with training, get more equipment into country. I think that the big problem is that the Ukrainians are clearly tired and struggling to train and mobilise enough people at the moment. But they don't want anything that locks in Russian gains, and that is about both people and territory, because at some point they've got to draw a line, and they definitely do not want that line that is enduring to be where it is now, because it makes it very difficult to defend the rest of Ukraine.
Thank you all. Thanks you, James, Matthew and Olga. And thank you for watching. We'll be back here on YouTube soon, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a Ukrainecast episode. But from all of us here, bye for now.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.